One day, Jackson, a young boy, was given a very important task by his father, Mr. Benson. His father, a hard-working man who had been raising him alone after the loss of his wife, trusted him to carry the money meant for his school fees. Jackson felt a great sense of pride as he was handed the money. His father looked at him with a serious expression, reminding him of the importance of the responsibility. "Jackson, this is really important. You mustn't lose it," Mr. Benson warned. Jackson nodded, his hands firmly gripping the money as he set off for school, feeling proud that his father trusted him with such a significant task. But as he walked along the busy streets, a sinking feeling began to rise in his chest. When he reached the school gate, he suddenly realized the money was no longer in his pocket. His heart raced as panic crept in. He immediately stopped and checked his bag and pockets, hoping to find it, but there was nothing. Frantically, Jackson retraced his steps, walking back along the road, his heart heavy with fear. With each passing moment, the sinking feeling grew. No matter how hard he searched, the money was gone. The crushing thought that he had lost the money for his school fees, a sum that his father had entrusted to him, filled him with dread. By the time Jackson arrived at school, he was overwhelmed with shame. His teacher, noticing his anxious expression, asked for the payment, but Jackson had nothing to give. With his voice trembling, he explained that he had lost the money. His teacher, though sympathetic, couldn't make an exception, and Jackson was sent home until the fees could be paid. As Jackson walked home, tears streamed down his face. He didn't know how to face his father or explain what had happened. He imagined his father's disappointment, his anger, and the disappointment of losing his trust. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. Jackson walked through the streets, his mind lost in the fear of what awaited him at home. He passed by familiar stores and stalls, but his thoughts remained with the money he had lost. It was like everything else had faded into the background. His whole world seemed to revolve around the loss of something so important, and he couldn't help but feel the burden of his mistake pressing down on him with every step. As Jackson walked home, still reeling from the loss of the money, he passed a small food stall on the side of the road. It was run by a kind woman named Madame Caroline, known for her warm smile and gentle demeanor. She sold cookies and small meals to make ends meet, working tirelessly every day to provide for her 2 young daughters. Jackson, however, was too lost in his thoughts to notice much around him. The shame of losing the money was overwhelming, and he barely noticed when Madame Caroline called out to him, her voice filled with concern. "Young man, why are you crying?" she asked, her eyes soft with empathy. Startled, Jackson wiped his tears away quickly and turned toward her stall. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of whether he should speak to a stranger about his troubles. But there was something about Madame Caroline's presence that felt comforting. Her kindness seemed to radiate from her, and he found himself trusting her, even though he didn't know her well. "I lost the money my father gave me for my school fees," Jackson explained, his voice shaky and filled with distress. "I can't find it anywhere. Now I'm afraid to go home. My father is going to be so angry." Madame Caroline's heart ached for the young boy standing before her. She could tell how much the situation was weighing on him, and her mind briefly drifted to her own struggles. Life had never been easy for her, and she knew all too well how important it was to pay bills and make ends meet. She looked at Jackson, whose face was red from crying, and made a decision. Reaching into the small pouch where she kept her earnings for the day, she pulled out some crumpled bills. It wasn't much, just enough to cover her needs, but she knew it could make all the difference for him. "Take this," she said softly, pressing the money into Jackson's hand. "It's enough to pay your school fees." Jackson stood frozen for a moment, staring at the money in disbelief. He couldn't believe a stranger would be so kind, especially knowing how hard life could be for people like Madame Caroline. His hands trembled as he accepted the money, overwhelmed by her generosity. "Thank you," Jackson exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. "I don't know how to repay you." Madame Caroline smiled warmly, her eyes kind. "You don't need to repay me," she said. "Just promise me you'll do well in school and make your father proud. That will be enough." Jackson nodded eagerly, wiping the last of his tears away. "I will, I promise," he said before rushing home, his heart lighter than it had been in hours. But in his relief, he forgot to mention to his father the kindness he had received from Madame Caroline. Still, he couldn't shake the gratitude he felt for the woman who had helped him when no one else would. Life moved on for Jackson, and he soon began to forget about the day he had lost his father's money and the kindness Madame Caroline had shown him. His school fees were paid, and the embarrassment began to fade, replaced by the routine of his studies and time spent with his father, Mr. Benson. A few months later, Jackson's family's fortunes took a drastic turn for the better. After years of hard work, Mr. Benson secured a large contract that brought in more money than they had ever seen before. Their lives, which had once been modest, were suddenly transformed. With the newfound wealth, Mr. Benson and Jackson moved into a larger, more comfortable home. They bought a new car, and Jackson was able to get new clothes and shoes. Life seemed perfect, and Jackson was happy with the changes. He felt proud of his father's success, and for the first time, they didn't have to worry about money. Jackson's future seemed bright, and there was a sense of security he hadn't known before. However, despite all the material comforts surrounding him, Jackson couldn't shake a feeling of emptiness. Something still didn't feel quite right. One afternoon, while driving through the city, Jackson glanced out of the car window and saw a familiar street. His mind suddenly flashed back to the day he had lost the money his father had given him. He remembered Madame Caroline and her food stall. He felt a pang of guilt as he thought about how he had never properly thanked her. His life had changed so much since then, but he hadn't forgotten the woman who had helped him when he was at his lowest. "Dad?" Jackson said hesitantly, breaking the silence in the car. "Can we stop for a minute? There's something I need to check." Mr. Benson, curious but willing to indulge his son, pulled the car over. Jackson got out and walked toward the spot where Madame Caroline's stall used to be. But as he reached the familiar street corner, he was disappointed to find that the stall was no longer there. There were no signs of Madame Caroline or her food stand. Jackson's heart sank and confusion set in. He approached a nearby vendor and asked if they knew what had happened to her. The vendor, with a sad shake of his head, told him that Madame Caroline had disappeared some time ago. "She hasn't been around for a while," the vendor explained. "Times got tough for her, and I heard she had to leave. I'm not sure where she went." Jackson stood there, stunned. He hadn't expected her to be gone, and a deep sense of guilt washed over him. All this time, while his life had been improving, the woman who had helped him was struggling. He realized just how thoughtless he had been, not telling his father about her kindness and not doing anything to help her after all these months. When Jackson returned to the car, his father noticed the troubled expression on his son's face. He could tell something was wrong. Jackson, feeling the weight of his regret, was now more determined than ever to find Madame Caroline and make things right. As the days passed, Jackson couldn't shake the weight of the guilt he felt for not having done more for Madame Caroline. Despite his success, there was an aching emptiness in his heart that only grew stronger with time. His life had changed drastically, but she was still stuck in a difficult situation. The memory of the woman who had helped him when he was struggling haunted him, and the realization that she was still living in hardship weighed heavily on him. Jackson couldn't stop thinking about how her life had been filled with constant struggle and how, despite everything, she had still found it in her heart to help him without expecting anything in return. Madame Caroline, after all, had been through so much. Since her husband's death, life had been incredibly hard for her. She had lost nearly everything and had to raise her 2 daughters alone. The constant fight to make ends meet had worn her down, but she kept going, always doing her best for her girls. Even after Jackson had gone on with his life, he knew she had been struggling just to survive. And now, as he walked through the streets of the city, Jackson realized how little he had done to help her after she had so selflessly helped him. Her struggles were far from over. Jackson had learned from a neighbor that Madame Caroline and her daughters were now living in an unfinished building on the outskirts of the city. They didn't have enough money to fix it, let alone afford a decent place to stay. And despite the ongoing difficulties they faced, Madame Caroline had continued to show resilience, always trying her best for her daughters. Jackson couldn't bear the thought of her still living in such dire conditions, knowing that he had the means to help her. One evening, as Jackson sat with his father, he couldn't keep his feelings bottled up any longer. He decided it was time to tell his father everything, to explain what Madame Caroline had done for him and how he had failed to help her in return. "Dad," Jackson began, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." His father, Mr. Benson, looked up from his paper, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, son?" Jackson took a deep breath, his mind racing with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "You remember the woman who helped me when I lost the money for school fees?" he asked. "Her name is Madame Caroline. She's been struggling ever since her husband died, and now she and her daughters are living in a place that's falling apart. I never told you about her because I was too ashamed, but I should have said something sooner." Mr. Benson sat back, surprised by the gravity of Jackson's words. Jackson could see the concern in his father's eyes, and though he was still unsure of how his father would respond, he knew it was time to make things right. He promised himself he wouldn't stop until he found her, no matter how long it took. He owed her everything: his education, his peace of mind, and so much more. After Jackson's confession to his father about Madame Caroline's help all those months ago, Mr. Benson remained silent for a moment, processing everything his son had said. Jackson could see the surprise in his father's eyes, but also a growing concern that matched his own. He had never spoken about Madame Caroline before, and now, finally, the truth was out. Jackson felt a mix of relief and guilt, but he knew he had made the right decision. He had to make up for the mistakes he had made by not telling his father sooner. Mr. Benson, though visibly surprised by the news, was quick to respond. "Jackson," he began, his voice calm yet firm, "I understand your feelings, but you should have told me about this sooner. It's not fair for you to carry this burden alone. You should have come to me." Jackson lowered his gaze, his heart heavy with regret. He knew his father was right. He shouldn't have kept something so important to himself, especially when it concerned someone who had shown him so much kindness. His shame at not having helped Madame Caroline sooner was overwhelming, but he also knew that he could still make it right. "I know, Dad," Jackson said quietly. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to disappoint you." Mr. Benson sighed and placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a sign of reassurance. "I understand. But now, Jackson, it's not too late. We can still do something to help her. We'll figure it out together." Jackson's heart lifted slightly at his father's words, though a part of him still felt the sting of regret. "I want to find her," Jackson said, determination in his voice. "I want to thank her properly and make sure she and her daughters have what they need. I can't just let her suffer when she helped me." Mr. Benson nodded. "We'll start asking around and see what we can find out. It's time to give back the kindness she showed you. And I'll help you." The two of them began asking people in the neighborhood if they knew anything about Madame Caroline. Jackson had no idea how difficult it would be to track her down. Weeks turned into months, and every lead they followed came to a dead end. It seemed that Madame Caroline had vanished without a trace. No one could tell them where she had gone or what had happened to her. Despite the frustration, Jackson never gave up. He was determined to repay the kindness she had shown him, even if it took a lifetime. As the days went by, Jackson's search for Madame Caroline became more than just a promise to her. It became a mission to do what was right. He had to find her. He had to make sure she knew how much her selflessness had meant to him, and he wouldn't rest until he did. Despite all the time that had passed, Jackson couldn't forget about Madame Caroline. His search for her continued, but after months of inquiries and dead ends, he was no closer to finding her. Life seemed to go on, and his own life had changed dramatically. He was doing well in school and had the support of his father, who had recently received a significant financial windfall. Jackson's family moved to a much larger house, and his father was more comfortable than ever before. Still, a sense of guilt lingered in Jackson's heart. He had everything he could have ever dreamed of, yet he couldn't stop thinking about Madame Caroline. The woman who had once given him her last bit of money was still out there, likely still struggling, and Jackson felt like he hadn't done enough to repay her. Then one day, as fate would have it, Jackson found himself back in the same part of town where Madame Caroline's stall had once been. It was a familiar street, one he'd passed by countless times, but this time it felt different. He could no longer ignore the nagging feeling in his chest, the guilt that had been there all along. "Dad," Jackson said, his voice tinged with hesitation, "can we stop here for a second? I need to check something." Mr. Benson, though busy, agreed to pull over, sensing the urgency in his son's voice. Jackson got out of the car and walked over to where Madame Caroline's stall had once stood. But when he arrived, his heart sank. The spot was empty, no sign of her, no stall, nothing. He asked a nearby vendor, hoping for some clue about where she had gone, but the vendor's response only deepened Jackson's sense of loss. "Oh, Madame Caroline," the vendor said with a sigh. "She hasn't been around for a while. Things got tough for her and I heard she had to leave. I'm not sure where she went." Jackson felt his chest tighten. He hadn't expected to hear that. His search had been fruitless, and now it seemed as though Madame Caroline had just vanished. He stood there for a moment, wondering how it was possible that someone who had shown him so much kindness could disappear without a trace. The sadness in his heart deepened as he realized that while his life had gotten better, Madame Caroline's had become even harder. When he returned to the car, his father noticed the troubled look on his face. Jackson felt the weight of his own shame, but he knew he couldn't carry it alone any longer. He had to tell his father everything: how Madame Caroline had helped him when no one else would, how he had never done anything in return, and how now he was filled with guilt for not finding her sooner. Jackson's search for Madame Caroline didn't end the way he had hoped. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't find her. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the urgency he felt started to fade. But the lessons she had taught him of kindness, selflessness, and the power of giving without expecting anything in return stayed with him. The years passed, and Jackson went on to pursue his studies with dedication, knowing that his path in life had been shaped by the help of someone who had given so freely when she had so little. He eventually earned a scholarship to study medicine abroad, achieving the dream he had once thought impossible. Through it all, Madame Caroline's kindness remained at the core of his character, influencing not just his career, but how he treated others. When Jackson returned home after his studies, he had not only grown as a person, but had also realized the depth of the promise he made to himself years ago to repay the kindness shown to him, no matter what it took. This became the driving force behind the decisions he made. With the support of his father, Jackson opened a hospital in the city, dedicated to providing care for those in need. It was his way of giving back to the community that had supported him throughout his life, just as Madame Caroline had supported him during his darkest moment. The hospital, well-equipped and modern, became a symbol of his commitment to helping others, just as Madame Caroline had helped him so many years ago. But even as he built his success, Jackson never forgot about her. He continued to search for any sign of Madame Caroline, though he never found her. Yet, her legacy lived on in the work he did, in the lives he touched, and in the selfless way he approached his role as a doctor. Jackson never stopped thinking about the woman who had given him her last bit of money, who had saved him from the weight of his own failure, and who had taught him that real worth isn't defined by wealth or status, but by the depth of one's heart. In a world where it's easy to forget the small acts of kindness that have shaped us, Jackson's story reminds us all that we should never underestimate the impact we can have on others. Whether through a simple gesture of helping a stranger in need or by choosing to support someone who has fallen, these moments of compassion have the power to change lives. Jackson learned this lesson early on, and he spent his life sharing that message with others. He realized that kindness is never truly lost. It ripples through the world in ways we may never fully understand. And sometimes the greatest gifts we receive are the ones that aren't repaid in the way we expect, but in the way we pay it forward.